The email arrived at 4:03 p.m. Subject: Important update regarding Omnicore restructuring. My name, David Chen, wasn't even on it. Just a generic salutation for the herd being led to slaughter. 20 years of my life, gone. My access card was probably already deactivated. All of this, just 2 hours before the company Christmas party, the one where I was supposed to receive a loyalty award. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. They fired us with a template, hoping we'd just disappear quietly into the holidays. My blood ran cold, then hot, with a fury I hadn't felt in years. I picked up my phone, but I didn't call my wife. I called my lawyer. "Mark," I said, "change of plans. We're going to a party." Mark wasn't just any lawyer. He was a piranha in a Savile Row suit, and my oldest friend. He'd seen me build my career at Omnicore from the ground up. When he answered, there was no surprise in his voice, only a low, dangerous hum of anticipation. "A Christmas party, David. Sounds festive. What's the occasion?" I laid it all out: the mass email, the 20 years of service, the loyalty award that was now a monument to their betrayal. A beat of silence on the line, then Mark's voice, pure steel. "Oh, this isn't just festive. This is a gift. They just handed us the entire case on a silver platter." He was already thinking 5 steps ahead. "I'll be at your place in 20. Wear the suit you were saving for that award. We're not just crashing this party, we're making a statement." A cold smile touched my lips for the first time all day. "Let them see the man they threw away," he added. "And let them meet his lawyer." The call ended, and the rage in my chest began to cool, sharpening into a single, perfect point of focus. The city lights of Chicago blurred into streaks of gold and red as Mark's Jaguar sliced through the evening traffic. The suit felt strange, like a costume for a play where I no longer knew my lines. 20 years. I hadn't just worked at Omnicore, I had helped build it. I was employee number 7, hired when Richard Sterling was still just a brilliant coder with a dream, not a CEO hiding behind HR-sanctioned emails. We used to work on fold-out tables, fueled by cheap pizza and the belief that we were changing the world. Richard would clap me on the back and say, "You're the foundation, Dave. The bedrock." Now that bedrock was being dynamited. The reason was a single word: Titan. The Titan project was my magnum opus. For 2 years it had consumed me. It was a complete overhaul of our failing logistics AI, a project everyone else said was impossible. I handpicked the team. I wrote the core architecture on my dining room table at 3 a.m., and I navigated the internal politics that tried to kill it a dozen times. My boss, Garrett Vance, a man whose greatest skill was rephrasing my ideas in meetings, called it a career killer. He fought me at every turn until he realized it might actually work. Then, suddenly, it became DAI's flagship initiative. Last week, we flipped the switch. It worked flawlessly. The early data projections were staggering, suggesting a 9-figure revenue stream within the first year. It was the win Omnicore desperately needed. I'd poured everything into it, reassuring my wife that the long nights and missed weekends would be worth it. The loyalty award at the party wasn't just a plaque. It was meant to be the public acknowledgement of that victory. Instead, they gave my victory to Garrett and gave me a pink slip. Garrett gets the bonus, the promotion, the glory. I get erased. They didn't even have the courage to do it to my face. They waited until the project was delivered, the knowledge transferred, and then they cut me out like a tumor, burying my name under 100 others in a mass firing. It wasn't just business. It was a heist. "They think you'll be too ashamed to show up," Mark said, his voice cutting through my thoughts. He glanced over at me, his eyes dark. "They think you'll crawl into a hole. They're counting on it." He was right. They saw me as a number on a spreadsheet, an unfortunate but necessary casualty. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten I was the bedrock. Mark pulled the car to a smooth stop in front of the glittering hotel entrance. Valets in red coats scurried forward. Through the glass doors I could see the party in full swing, a sea of familiar faces laughing, oblivious. "Ready to remind them?" Mark asked, a predatory glint in his eye. I took a deep breath, the cold Chicago air steadying me. The fury was gone, replaced by an icy calm. "Bedrock," I said, more to myself than to him, "is hard to break." We walked through the grand glass doors, and a wave of warm, spiced air and polite chatter washed over us. The party was in a lavish ballroom, all glittering chandeliers and tables draped in silver cloth. For a moment it was just noise and light. Then, the first person saw me. It was Sarah from marketing, her eyes widening over the rim of a champagne flute. She froze mid-sip. Her reaction was a ripple that spread through the crowd. The conversations didn't stop, but they faltered. Heads turned. A pocket of unnatural quiet began to form around the entrance, a dead zone in the festive hum. They were looking at a ghost. Mark's presence amplified the effect. He was a shark in a sea of well-fed fish, and they could smell the blood in the water, even if it was their own. My eyes scanned the room, past the nervous glances and whispered asides, searching for the architects of my career's demolition. I found them by the towering ice sculpture of the Omnicore logo, Garrett Vance. He was laughing, a booming, false sound that always grated on me. He had a small crowd around him, hanging on his every word. He gestured animatedly, no doubt recounting a heavily fictionalized version of the Titan Project's success. He was wearing my victory like a bespoke suit. And standing right next to him, basking in the reflected glory, was Richard Sterling, the CEO, the man who called me Bedrock. He clapped Garrett on the shoulder, the exact same gesture he'd used with me 20 years ago in a garage full of dreams. The hypocrisy was so potent it was almost a physical force, threatening to knock the wind out of me. But the icy calm held. This wasn't a haunting, it was a hunt. "There they are," Mark murmured, his voice low, "the whole conspiracy in one convenient location." We started walking. We didn't hurry. We moved with a deliberate, unshakable purpose. The crowd parted for us, a silent, human sea receding from the inevitable. The whispers followed us, like a wake. Garrett saw me first. The self-satisfied smile on his face didn't just fade, it collapsed. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, panicked mask. Richard turned, following Garrett's gaze, and his expression hardened into one of pure cold annoyance. We stopped directly in front of them. The small circle of sycophants melted away, suddenly finding their drinks needed refilling. "David," Garrett stammered, recovering slightly. He tried to paste on a look of mournful sympathy. I didn't expect to see you here. Listen, I am so sorry about the news. It was a top-down decision, completely out of my hands." "I'm sure it was," I said, my voice dangerously even. The sound of it cut through his facade. "But you're still taking the credit for Titan, aren't you? And the bonus?" Garrett's jaw worked, but no sound came out. His eyes darted toward Richard for help, but the CEO remained silent, watching me with an unreadable, reptilian stillness. This was Mark's cue. He stepped forward slightly, extending a hand that no one took. "Garrett Vance, I presume?" Mark's voice was pure courtroom silk, smooth and deadly. "Mark Levin. I'm Mr. Chen's counsel." He let the word hang in the air, a declaration of war. "We have a few questions about the Titan Project. Specifically, about intellectual property theft, wrongful termination, and corporate fraud. But don't worry," he added with a predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We can save the details for the deposition." The word deposition hung in the air, sucking the festive cheer from our corner of the ballroom. Garrett looked like a fish on a hook, gasping, his eyes pleading with Richard. But Richard Sterling didn't even glance at him. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, his gaze fixed on me. The ice in his glass clinked softly, the only sound in the suffocating silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, chilling murmur, meant only for us. "David, you are embarrassing yourself." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The condescension was a weapon in itself. "Whatever severance package you're unhappy with, this sideshow is not the way to negotiate. You and your ambulance chaser should leave before you do more damage to your reputation." He turned to dismiss us, a king waving away a peasant. My reputation? Mark's laugh was short and sharp. A crack of ice. "Let's talk about Omnicore's reputation when my client's proprietary code, the very core of the Titan project, is presented as evidence in a federal court. The code he wrote on his personal laptop, Richard. The code with a digital watermark even a fool like Garrett couldn't find." Garrett flinched as if struck. Richard's eyes snapped back to Mark, the calm facade finally showing a hairline crack. For the first time, he looked at Mark not as a nuisance, but as a threat. That was my opening. I stepped forward, my voice as quiet as Richard's, but carrying the weight of 20 years. "You called me bedrock, Richard. Remember? You said it in the garage, over cold pizza. You build on bedrock. You don't dynamite it after it's served its purpose." For a single beautiful second, I saw it. The flicker of the old Richard, the man I once knew, replaced instantly by the cold fury of the CEO who had just been exposed. The mask was back in place, but we had all seen it slip. He set his glass down on a nearby table with a sharp click. "This party is over for you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, lethal and final. He subtly signaled a man in a dark suit near the ballroom entrance, head of security. "Garrett, call the police. Tell them Mr. Chen is trespassing." He looked straight through me, his eyes now empty of anything but contempt. "And have him arrested for harassment." Quote, the command to have me arrested hung in the air, a drop of poison in the festive atmosphere. Garrett, ever the sycophant, was already fumbling for his phone, his face a pathetic mix of fear and relief. He was being given a direct order, a way to make the problem, me, disappear in handcuffs. Richard's expression was one of absolute finality. He had played his trump card. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Frank, whom I'd shared coffee with 100 times, began to move toward us. He looked genuinely apologetic, but his job was his job. The crowd, now completely silent, watched with a morbid fascination. This wasn't just a corporate party anymore. It was a public execution. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of adrenaline. But beside me, Mark was an island of lethal calm. He didn't even glance at the approaching guard. He simply raised a hand, a small, placating gesture. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Richard," Mark said, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "And Garrett," he added, his eyes flicking to my former boss, "calling the police right now would be the single most expensive phone call of your life, I promise you." Garrett's thumb froze over his screen. Richard's face tightened, the skin around his eyes crinkling with irritation. "Threats? Is that all you have?" "Oh no," Mark said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "This isn't a threat. This is a courtesy." He reached into the sleek leather briefcase he carried and retrieved a thick sheaf of documents bound with a blue cover sheet. The air in the ballroom seemed to crackle with anticipation. He held the documents up so the light from the chandelier glinted off the official seal. "This," Mark announced, his voice now resonating through the hushed room, "is a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. Signed less than an hour ago by Judge Annabelle Foster of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois." He took a deliberate step forward and placed a copy of the documents into Richard Sterling's hand. Richard took it reflexively, his eyes locked on the court seal as if it were a venomous snake. "What it means, Richard," Mark explained, his tone now that of a professor lecturing a particularly slow student, "is that as of 5:15 p.m. this evening, Omnicore Solutions, its employees, its partners, and its subsidiaries are legally enjoined from launching, marketing, promoting, selling, licensing, or profiting from any and all technology related to the Titan project." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, on Richard, on the papers in his hand. "That 9-figure revenue stream you were so excited about?" Mark continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's frozen. That big press release scheduled for Monday? It's dead. Every deal you have in the pipeline for Titan is now a potential violation of a federal court order." He then stepped over to a pale, sweating Garrett and slapped another copy of the order against his chest. "Consider yourselves served." Richard stared at the papers, his knuckles white. The mask of the untouchable CEO had shattered, replaced by the raw, incandescent fury of a cornered animal. "This is a stunt. I'll have my lawyers bury you." "Your lawyers are welcome to try," Mark shot back. "They can explain to Judge Foster how my client's proprietary, watermarked code ended up as the core of your company's flagship product without a contract, without payment, and immediately preceding his wrongful termination. I'm sure she'll be fascinated." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "And as for your other little problem," Mark turned his attention to the security guard, Frank, who had stopped a few feet away, looking utterly confused. "Frank, a word of advice. Assaulting an owner of the company you work for is generally grounds for immediate dismissal." Richard scoffed. "Owner? He's a fired employee." "Is he?" Mark's smile was razor-sharp. He looked around at the captivated audience. "I wonder how many of you know that as a bonus for his initial architectural work on Titan over a year ago, Richard here granted David a 1% equity stake in Omnicore." My own breath caught in my throat. I had forgotten. It was a small grant, a token gesture, made in an email Richard had sent late one night after a breakthrough, something I'd filed away and never thought about again. But Mark hadn't forgotten. He never forgets anything. Mark pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a printout of that very email. "It was never formally rescinded," he said, holding it up for all to see. "Which means my client, David Chen, is not a trespasser. He's a shareholder, a part owner. And he is here tonight, on his own property, to stop the board from illegally using his intellectual property to defraud the rest of the shareholders." The entire narrative of the evening pivoted on that single point. I wasn't the ghost at the feast. I was the landlord, showing up to change the locks. The whispers in the crowd were no longer about my misfortune. They were about Richard's fraud. Garrett looked like he was about to be physically ill, the court order trembling in his hand. Richard stood frozen, the injunction a testament to his spectacular miscalculation. He had tried to have me arrested, and in doing so had walked directly into a perfectly laid trap in front of his entire company. He looked from the court order to me, and in his eyes I saw the full, horrifying scope of his defeat. He hadn't just lost a legal battle, he had lost control. Mark turned to me, his job done. "I believe," he said, his voice low but clear, "they were about to give you an award." He nodded toward the stage, where a small table held a row of gleaming crystal trophies. "You should probably go get it." The sound in the ballroom had changed. It was no longer a hum of chatter punctuated by shock. It was the dead, compressed silence of a vacuum. Mark's words echoed in that void, and I felt the entire axis of my world tilt and lock into a new, terrifying and exhilarating alignment. Owner. Shareholder. The words were abstract, but the power they granted was a physical sensation, a current running up my spine. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the reality of it sink in. Mark had built a fortress around me, and then handed me the keys to the kingdom I had been exiled from. His words hung in the air. "You should probably go get it." I started walking toward the stage. It was the longest 10 yards of my life. The crowd didn't just part, they recoiled, their faces a gallery of awe and fear. I saw junior engineers I'd mentored, their eyes wide. I saw middle managers who had kissed up to Garrett now looking at him with undisguised contempt. They weren't looking at a ghost anymore, they were looking at justice. I walked right past Garrett. He flinched, physically shrinking into himself, his eyes glued to the floor as if searching for a hole to crawl into. The court order was still clutched in his hand, a paper shield against a tidal wave. I didn't even spare him a glance. My focus was on Richard. He stood rigid, a statue of impotent rage. As I passed, his eyes met mine. There was no apology, no remorse. There was only the pure, black hatred of a king dethroned in his own court. He had tried to erase me, and instead, I had become the only thing in the room anyone could see. I held his gaze, letting him see the bedrock he'd tried to shatter, now risen up to swallow him whole. I reached the low stage and stepped up. The small table was there, just as Mark had said. On it sat a row of crystal awards. The one in the middle had a small engraved plaque, David Chen, 20 years of loyalty and excellence. The sheer, galling hypocrisy of it was a masterpiece. I ignored the award for a moment and walked to the podium. The microphone was live. I picked it up, and the soft pop of it activating echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. Every eye was on me. "Good evening," I said. My voice was steady, amplified, filling every corner of the room. For those of you who didn't see the 4 o'clock email, my name is David Chen. I was, until a few hours ago, your colleague. A nervous ripple went through the crowd. I was invited here tonight to receive this. I gestured to the crystal trophy. An award for 20 years of loyalty. 20 years of building this company alongside Richard Sterling. Instead, they put my name on a list with over 100 others and terminated me with a generic template. I let that sink in. I could feel the anger in the room shifting, no longer directed at me, but at the man standing frozen by the ice sculpture. But let's be honest, I continued, my voice hardening. This award was never about loyalty. It was meant to be my payment for the Titan project. It was my consolation prize while Garrett Vance took the credit, the promotion, and the 7-figure bonus that came with it. I looked directly at Garrett, who now seemed to be having trouble breathing. The Titan project is mine. I wrote the architecture. I led the team. And as a federal judge agreed just this evening, Omnicore will not make $1 single from it. Not until the man who built it is recognized and compensated. I then turned my gaze back to Richard. Richard, you once told me I was the bedrock of this company. You were right. And you taught me a valuable lesson tonight. You can't trust the people who sign your paychecks. You can only trust the foundation you build for yourself. I picked up the heavy crystal award. It was cold and impersonal. It meant nothing. I walked to the edge of the stage and stopped right in front of Garrett. He looked up at me, his face a mess of sweat and terror. I didn't say a word. I simply held out the award. His hands trembled as he took it, his fingers fumbling on the smooth crystal. "Enjoy your bonus," I said, my voice low enough for only those nearby to hear, but the meaning was clear to everyone. Then I turned, walked off the stage, and headed for the door where Mark was waiting. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The silence behind me was absolute, the sound of an empire falling. We walked out of the ballroom, leaving the wreckage of a party and the ruins of 2 men's careers behind us, stepping out into the cold Chicago night. The heavy ballroom doors swung shut behind us, and the suffocating silence was replaced by the crisp bite of the December wind. The city's noise, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the L train, felt clean, honest. For a long moment we just stood there on the curb, the steam of our breath pluming in the icy air. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a profound, hollow stillness in its wake. Mark broke the silence, a low chuckle in his throat. "I'd say that went rather well." The look on Richard's face when I mentioned Judge Foster, I'm going to frame that memory. I couldn't summon a laugh. Not yet. I just nodded, feeling the weight of the last 20 years lift and the terrifying lightness of an unknown future settle in its place. I had walked in as a victim. I walked out as a wrecking ball. The valet pulled up in the Jaguar, its engine a low purr. He held the door, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes were wide with a curiosity he couldn't quite hide. News travels fast. Once inside the warm leather interior of the car, Mark turned to me. The predatory lawyer was gone, replaced by the concerned friend. "You okay, Dave?" "I don't know what I am," I admitted, my voice raspy. "I just torched my entire career, my entire life." "No," Mark corrected me, his tone firm, unwavering. "You didn't torch it, you reclaimed it. That injunction buys us time. The shareholder status buys us a seat at the table. This wasn't the final act, David. This was the opening argument. We didn't just embarrass them, we established leverage. They can't launch Titan. They can't ignore you." And every single executive in that room knows that Richard Sterling and Garrett Vance tried to screw over the one man who held the keys to their biggest asset. He was right. The moral victory was absolute. I hadn't just gotten revenge, I had exposed the truth in the most public way imaginable. I had taken back my name. The bedrock wasn't broken. It had shifted the landscape. I looked out at the glittering Chicago skyline, the towers like monuments to ambition and betrayal. "So what now?" I asked, the question hanging between us. Mark put the car in gear, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Now? Now we let them sweat through the holidays. And on Monday morning, we don't just ask for a severance package, we ask for the company. Okay, you get that same exact email an hour before the party. You decide you're still going. Who are you bringing as your +1 to make the biggest statement?"